Hi, everyone. We'll take a minute or so just to get everything set up here and get connected to some of the other services. So just bear with us for a second. We'll just take another moment or two as we get wired into LinkedIn and get wired into YouTube and so on. Just hang on 2 ticks, and we got the thumbs up from Sean. So we can get going. So hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Conor O'Neill. I'm head of product here in NearForm, and I'd really like to welcome you to Decoded. So this is a web series we've been doing for quite a few months now. On lots of different topics, but it's really about putting technology in context. It's about exploring real life challenges, real world scenarios that people are encountering around software development and everything to do with the development of apps. And I think we've got a real cracker for you here today. Just before we start, a couple of little, the usual, you're all muted, but we do actually want to hear from you. So you can see that Q&A box down the bottom. Do make use of it and make use of it throughout the session. We might get to some of them during it, but we'll definitely get to your questions at the end. We always leave some time over to do that Q&A and go through things. So yeah, no, please, anything particularly on this topic, anything and feedback you want to give us. And just so you know, this is being recorded. It will be available for playback later on nearform.com, on YouTube, but it's also being live streamed. So it's been live streamed on YouTube and on LinkedIn, I hope. And with that, we'll get on to today's topic. So we're going to be talking about accessibility and really what it means now, because I think, old fogies like me might have a very old-fashioned view of what accessibility is and may not be aware of all the things that have changed in recent years. And really, we're hoping to, address a lot of the topics, not just as a designer, but developers, product managers, really anybody, involved in web development and mobile development. But it's not me going to be, covering this because, as I said, I don't know enough about it. We have two people from NearForm who these are two people who are really passionate about accessibility from everything I've talked to them about already. So we have Jack Clark, who's a senior software engineer, and we have Matt Obee, who's a senior product designer. So it's brilliant to have you both, guys. Very welcome.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Excellent. So we'll dig right in, and I would say a softball, because it's not actually a softball at all, to get us going, and it's to try and, I suppose, kind of capture what it is we're going to be talking about today. So how would you define accessibility in 2021? What is it, and what's involved? Matt, can I throw that one to you?
Yeah, sure. So accessibility is ultimately about designing products and services that can be used by people with disabilities, right? And we're probably all familiar with that from the physical space, the built environment that we used to move around in quite freely. We're probably used to seeing quite overt signs of accessibility in the shape of wheelchair ramps and tactile paving. And we've got the same sorts of considerations in the digital space, in websites and apps. But the way we solve those problems is obviously very different because of technology and the medium. And we're probably all familiar with usability as well, which is the idea that by focusing on the size of buttons and typography and color and spacing and layout, we can make things really easy or really difficult for people to use. But usability often doesn't go quite far enough for people with disabilities. So that's really where accessibility comes in. It does that extra bit on top to remove those additional barriers. So in that way, you can think of accessibility as a sort of usability plus, it's sometimes described as, right? The interesting thing about accessibility is that the benefits are actually far more reaching than people realize, because the things that we do for people who are blind, for example, also benefit sighted people in particular environments, maybe because they're driving, so they're not able to look at the screen, or they're otherwise distracted. So they're essentially blind in that particular context, right? So they benefit from the things that we think about earlier on for people who have permanent disabilities. And in the same way, the things we do for someone who's deaf will benefit those of us who are in a loud environment. So moving through an airport is the example I often use, or working in a busy environment like a building site. You'll be relying on transcripts and things like that instead of the sound cues. So that's really interesting, and it's important to remember the core mission is to make things accessible to people with permanent disabilities, but also recognize the additional benefits you get when you think about it early on for everyone else. And you can think about it in terms of permanent disabilities, temporary impairments, and also situational impairments, which we've touched on there. And Microsoft has done a lot of work on this, and they describe that as solving for one, extending to many. So the idea that working within those initial constraints of the permanent disabilities, you get loads of extra benefits for everyone else further on.
That's a huge surprise for me that it is more, I think like most people, I would have been entirely focused on actually permanent, not even temporary, but like just the permanent. But the concept of this situational thing had never been on my radar before. So I have to think an awful lot of people are going to be it's a real nugget, and it's a real insight into everything around here. But I suppose when I was talking to you guys earlier, one of the things I kept hitting, and I'm sure I was frustrating you, was conflating, accessibility with other things. So, are there things that are effectively outside of scope, or aren't quite accessibility, that people tend to kind of drop into that bucket?
Yeah, so I would say a common one is things like data connections, the speed of the connection. Sometimes people roll that into accessibility, and that's obviously very important, but I would keep that very separate from the thing that we're discussing today, which is people with disabilities and the other user experience issues that we've got. Sometimes people worry about JavaScript. If you use JavaScript, your thing is therefore not accessible anymore. That's not the case. You can build anything. You can build JavaScript applications in an accessible way, absolutely. So there are some other, so those sorts of technical considerations are sometimes rolled into accessibility when I think the focus should be on the people more than those technical issues.
Yeah, I like that. The focus on the people is very good. And you've already kind of mentioned usability, but they're not the same thing, clearly. I mean, is that fair to say?
Fair to say, yeah. So accessibility does that extra bit on top of usability, so it's a superset of it, if you will.
And the I suppose user experience is, I suppose, one aspect of all of that. And one term you both of you used when I was talking to you recently, which I hadn't encountered before, and again, this is for me, I think on this particular webinar, it's this sort of journey of discovery for me, that it is, I think when you generally work in tech, and you become very familiar with just kind of general terms and acronyms and so on, but there's certain things that are kind of outside of our experience, or we hear the term and we don't actually get a handle on what it's about. Can you give us just some insights into this idea of inclusive design and universal design and so on?
Yeah, so inclusive design and universal design, those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, and there's a lot of overlap between them, but they come at problems from quite different schools of thought. So universal design really came out of disciplines like industrial design and architecture. So it assumes physical products firstly. And the assumption from universal design is that you will come away with a thing that works for everyone or works for lots of people. So an example might be kitchen utensils are a common one. You might see those kitchen utensils they make, they're ambidextrous. They can be used by left or right hand, and they're sort of padded for people who have arthritis and things like that. So it assumes that you'll do the process of design, you'll come away with an object that works for everyone. Inclusive design, on the other hand, is more of a methodology for designing. And inclusive design says that you should involve lots of diverse perspectives in that design process. And it doesn't necessarily make any assumptions about what will come out of that process. So it might be one product, or it might be several products that solve slightly different problems or the same problem in different ways. And there's overlap between those, and accessibility belongs to both of those things. We tend to work in the inclusive design arena. So we try and make our process one that in which we consider lots of diverse opinions, and we don't make any assumptions about what will come out of it necessarily.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And I suppose from thinking about people, and I hate using the word personas in this case because you're getting away from effectively the concept of people, but are there examples you can give us around, I guess, the sort of assistive technologies that are involved in all of this. I think there's the common ones that most people, I assume, are familiar with. But possibly, Jack, can you talk about some of those technologies that people use in this whole area?
Yeah, so an assistive technology is fundamentally a technology that helps somebody with a disability do something that they wouldn't be able to without it. And when we're talking about the web, the most common one that you probably touched on is a screen reader. So a screen reader would enable, it's a piece of software that essentially reads out the text that's currently on the screen to the user. It might read it out via audio or send it to a braille display that a user is using. So most commonly, this would be used by a person that's blind, but it can also be used by people with dyslexia or reading difficulties, anybody that struggles to read text, to help them use the website or digital content that they're trying to access. Other examples, I think that's something that people don't necessarily think of as assistive technology, but a lot of people are unable to use a mouse. So they might lack the fine motor skills required to use a mouse. So they might rely solely on keyboard navigation to navigate around a website. Or other adaptive hardwares like switch inputs. They might have a mechanical switch that they can press to navigate around around a website. They might have a sip and puff control, even lots of different ways that lots of different types of hardware and inputs that they can use to navigate around a website, all that kind of rely on that keyboard accessibility that we build into the web to be able to use our applications. So lots of different things that we can try and use and learn about, but fundamentally keyboard accessibility, screen readers are probably the main ones that we need to focus on as web accessibility professionals.
Gotcha. And I suppose we've talked about the what now and set some context on it, but when, if we think about organizations going to do this, obviously there's laws in every country, and people should obey the law, but that's not, we're not having that conversation. I think we want to have a far deeper conversation than ticking a legal box. Would you, but just looking, I suppose, at that sort of legal piece, how, in the whole world of conformance, if conformance is the bare minimum, if we treat, conformance is the bare minimum that people should be doing, what are the basics that are involved there? I mean, are there specific standards that are, I'll say the word global, but, not non-country specific? Where do people actually start to go on this, hopefully a journey to being far more accessible than they do?
Yeah, so there are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So WCAG, which is commonly shortened to, are the kind of global go-to standards for web accessibility. And it's what a lot of laws are based on. And that really gives you a large set of guidelines for things that we should and shouldn't be doing. They're quite high level. They don't necessarily go into low-level details too much, but it comprises of 3 different levels of conformance. And that's level A, which is the bare minimum level that you should meet to make sure your site's accessible. And then there's a level AA, which you have to meet everything in the level A and also all of the things that are in AA. And then AAA, which is kind of the highest bar of accessibility standards. And AAA isn't actually required by a lot of laws. It tends to be AA because there's a lot of stuff in AAA that's quite hard to reach. But it's kind of a 3-tiered system that pretty much is like I say, the global standard when we're talking about digital accessibility that we should aim to be meeting.
So, and based on that, I can presumably assume that 99.999% of websites are, perfectly accessible then, given that it's the law, no?
Well, you'd hope so. But yeah, I mean, there's a survey that's done by a company called Web Accessibility in Mind. And they actually, I think it was 2018 or 2019, did a survey of the top 1 million websites on the internet. and they found that roughly 98% of those websites had WCAG violations on their homepages. So it is definitely an industry-wide problem. The internet isn't accessible, and it's something that we need to change. We're excluding a lot of people from modern culture and modern technology and services by not making accessible websites. So it's definitely a very important thing. But it's worth mentioning that purely just conformance to WCAG is probably not good enough either. As Matt's already touched on, accessibility is part of usability. Just ticking these checklists, ticking these boxes, making sure that our websites are conformance doesn't necessarily mean it's a good experience for these users. So I think it's well, obviously we should be aiming to be conformant. We shouldn't aim to be conformant and leave it at that. We should really be striving to make better experiences for everyone. And a lot of the time we find when we're making products accessible, we actually make the product better for people and a better experience for people that don't have accessibility, don't have disabilities either. So like Matt gave some physical world examples, like, and there are physical world examples, like if we ramps instead of stairs for wheelchair users make the physical world easier to use for people that can walk. Even elevators, that kind of thing, are commonly used by people that can walk, even though they're probably primarily there for wheelchair users. But it's the same in the web. So like the touching back on the situational and temporary disabilities. So a lot of the stuff that we do for keyboard navigation, even though it's put in there for people without fine motor controls, will benefit people that, you know, are currently holding a baby or don't have or have one arm that's busy eating a sandwich or something like that. So you can see that as we start to think about it as more of as we stop thinking about it as purely for fixing things for people with disabilities, we're starting to make an experience that really is better for everyone. I think that's what it is at the core of it, making sure our products are usable and a good experience for as many people as possible. And conformance is just one part of that.
And that to me, just as I would say a web user, that it ticks a lot of boxes, and to use the wrong term there, but it really does. Because, you know, it isn't just, you know, you're meeting your legal requirements. You're actually embracing this thing, and, you know, you're creating this, hopefully, this culture of doing things right. And, you know, not just for legal reasons, but for clearly moral reasons. And based on what you're saying, you know, you're giving, the more people you give a good experience to, that's a business, presumably a business case for doing this, right? Now, but back to, I don't want to harp on about the box ticking, but, you know, there's obviously going to be people who want to take shortcuts, who don't want to put the work in, who want to just, well, we're conformed and that's it. Can you give us some sort of horror stories or the downsides of trying to do quick and dirty, Matt?
Yeah, so a problem at the moment is overlays. I'm not a fan of overlays. So if you're not familiar with overlays, these are the things that you can install on your website that, like you do a tracking code, a bit of JavaScript, and they aim to, or they claim to, firstly detect any issues you've got on that particular page and fix them automatically. And they also provide a suite of tools, often for the end user, that let them change text size and contrast, color contrast, and sometimes they have a text-to-speech engine built into them as well. And I think, firstly, obviously, fixing accessibility issues at runtime is never going to be a good idea, just for performance. And the issues that they detect, generally speaking, is quite a small subset of the issues that we need to look for. Most of the issues need to be looked at by a human. A human needs to actually evaluate them. And while you can sometimes detect them and you can sometimes fix them in a way that would satisfy an automated check, you're not actually fixing the underlying problems. You're not actually providing a good experience to the user. And in terms of the tools that they provide to that end user, in most cases, people who need those adjustments are going to have them already on their machine, because your website's not the only website they go to, right? So it's if you're expecting them to come to your site and configure this tool, learn how to use it and get it looking right, and then go to another website and use maybe another tool and configure it again, it just doesn't make sense. And I think if you're gonna invest in one of these tools, maybe consider whether instead you just invest in your own product. You know, invest in your team, upskill your team, resolve those problems rather than masking them, rather than, you know, giving your money to a third party that's not really solving those problems in a meaningful way.
And actually on that, is it reasonable to say, Jack, that, you know, nowadays you are, as developers, getting a lot of stuff kind of given to you out of the box, whether it's, you know, OSs, that, you know, browsers, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think to Matt's point about users usually come with their own suite of tools, that the platforms that we work on are accessible by default. So well-written HTML tends to have very limited, if any, accessibility issues. It usually comes down to kind of the language used, that kind of thing. But good, well-written semantic HTML is accessible, and screen readers know how to interpret it, know how to read it. So I like to think of it as every single accessibility barrier that we put in as we're building products, we should probably treat as a regression. Somewhere along the development lifecycle, we have had an oversight or not considered accessibility at some point, whether that be in the planning phase, the design phase, the development phase, or the testing phase. Accessibility issues that we put in are probably caused by us not thinking about it as we were building that feature at some point along the line. So if I write a standard HTML document, it's probably the JavaScript or the styling that I've put on top of that, or the way that I've written the HTML that has caused those accessibility issues, not the platform by default. So definitely there's a lot of accessibility baked into the platform.
And that, so people are is that a phrase? De-accessibility, accessibility-ifying something that started as accessible. And I suppose that's leading us in a little bit, I suppose, into that the methodologies and the approaches that people should be taking. I mean, are there, just to kind of get us in, and not specifically talking about specific tools and so on, but how you approach this? You talked about kind of bringing in regressions there. Are there other things that people should always have as their sort of go-to for making sure they're doing this right?
Yes, and I think there are lots of things that people need to be doing at all parts in the project lifecycle. That starts with planning, and it really starts with thinking about all of the diverse user groups that will be using your application from the beginning, from the birth of the idea, if you will. Starting the conversations early with clients, stakeholders, thinking about the different groups of people that we need to accommodate for. An interesting thing that has really stuck with me over the last few weeks, I attended another accessibility webinar recently by the Government Digital Services in the UK. They hosted a webinar by the BBC team, who are well known for their accessibility culture in the UK anyway. And they talked about the planning phase. And I think typically when we're at the ideation phase or the planning phase of a new project, we'll think about the kind of browsers that we want to include, the browsers we're happy to exclude based on the percentage of users that are currently using them. And he flipped that question. Credit Gareth Ford-Williams, who was talking at the point, but he flipped the question and said, so who are we willing to exclude from our products? And just that simple perspective change really stuck with me since then. And he said it's a lot harder for stakeholders at the beginning of a project to say we're willing to exclude blind users and that kind of thing. So I think thinking about it in a different way and getting people who are passionate about accessibility and championing accessibility into the project as early as possible is the first phase. So not really tools as you asked for at that point, but that's really where it starts. And then right through to initial user testing and design. Matt, you can probably talk more about how we do it in design.
Yeah, so design, I think Jack's covered most of it there in terms of, so design is typically the first chance we get to talk to the client about accessibility and ask them some questions about it. And I think in the past, kind of going back to a point that Jack was making actually about flipping the perspective there, in the past, in the industry-wide, there was a tendency to ask, does this need to be accessible? Which is not a question we ask about performance or security. It's just taken as a given that, yes, it will be secure. And obviously there are grades of security. Some products are more secure than others, necessarily, if you're building a bank, for example. Same thing is true of accessibility, but there needs to be an assumption that it will be at least, to some extent accessible, have a good accessible baseline. So those design sessions, requirements gathering, scoping, which we typically run in workshops at NearForm, are really got good opportunity for us to talk to the client about that, not ask them whether it should be accessible, but start with the assumption that it will be, and then spend some time thinking about going back to those things we spoke about earlier with the permanent and temporary and situational considerations. We need to look at the features we're having, the content we're having, and then think about who's going to be using it in what sorts of situations, and what changes do we need to make to make that easy to make that possible, really.
Yeah, the two comments you made there, that they're actually, I think they're going to stick with me. You know, one is who are we going to exclude, and you know, does this need to be accessible? It kind of almost highlights the ridiculousness of the thought processes that people may be going through. And I've hit it recently in something I was looking at where people were talking about the use, for example, of QR codes, which that's a major challenge for a lot of people. And given that, what are the alternatives that could be used in the same context, but are accessible to a wider range of people? So that's, I'm now going to ask myself those questions from now on, because it totally changes how I'm looking at that. That is very, very cool. And you know, I know we said, I said let's not talk about tools, but I suppose, you know, given we don't have an enormous amount of time around that tooling, are there specific tools that people should be aware of? Not even, you know, branded tools, but tool areas that they may not be familiar with when it comes to the design and the development phases of this.
So from the design phase, I'd say there are fewer tools in the design phase, because lots of the tools expect to look at code, and we're not necessarily touching code at that point. And lots of accessibility features are inherently part of code. They're defined in code, and they don't exist until you get to that code stage. But things like color contrast checkers we often use in the design process, and there are loads of those. So literally just pick one you like and one that fits with your particular workflow. Some of them plug into the applications we use, like Figma and Sketch. Some of them work in the browser, but they all do a similar sort of job. There are tools for testing animation and flash rates for people with epilepsy. And there are tools for testing reading levels of our content to make sure the content's readable. And then beyond that, it probably moves into Jack's domain, into the code, where lots of the testing and automation takes place.
Yep. Excuse me. Yeah, so Obee's touched on it, but usually if I was to receive some designs from the designers and start to develop on them, the things that Matt's talked about, so the color contrast issues, would usually be the things that I would already hope that would be solved already, because things like color contrast can be an issue to change, especially when colors in a design system are based on a brand's color palette, that kind of thing. So hopefully this is why we're talking about including it at all phases of the project lifecycle, because hopefully by the time it gets to development, color contrast is not an issue for us. But there definitely are tools as developers that we can use. There's kind of a mixture of automated checking. So I would always use automated checkers as a browser extension, and an automated checker is something that will kind of perform static analysis on your HTML and your CSS, or even look at a page that's loaded in a browser, like via a browser extension or in a headless browser, that kind of thing, and check for common accessibility issues that it can detect just by looking at the code. These are simple things like HTML semantics, whether an image has got alternative text, whether a button has a name, that kind of thing, whether a link has an href. A lot of things that would be kind of expensive and monotonous for us as developers and testers to check can be automated, but it's worth noting that not everything can be automated. There's always going to be a level of manual testing and understanding that's going to be required. But definitely rely on these automated checkers as and when you can to free you up to do this, to have more time to do this manual testing. So you can run automated checkers in CI against your built sites that are configured with all of your live pages in production. We use Storybook at NearForm, which is kind of, as you're building out React components or components in any language, you can document different variations of your UI components, and we'll run accessibility tests against each of those as well. So you're kind of capturing accessibility at a lower level in your design system and making sure different variations that you might not capture just by going to your homepage and running a checker are also checked for accessibility issues. So these are a very, very important tool in our armory for making sure that our features are accessible. Code review is a really important tool. People in the team that have some accessibility knowledge and awareness, checking code, making sure that there's nothing missing there. But then there is a level of manual testing. So that comes down to awareness, obviously, but simple things like tabbing through the features that you're building, learning how to use a screen reader. So Mac OS and Windows have screen readers built in. There are lots of tutorials on just how to get up and running. So doing some manual testing of your features to make sure that you can use them, even with your screen turned off, just by using a screen reader, making sure you can use it in those ways. And then the same as Matt says, there's color contrast checkers, color blindness simulators, network throttlers, lots of different things we can do to test our applications in various different states with different tools and assistive technology simulators. So a huge kind of range of tooling available. It's just picking the right ones for the different situations and different features that you're building.
So I hadn't realized, I suppose over the past couple of years, more and more stuff has gone into stuff. It was technical again, has gone into CI/CD that hadn't previously been, and I found it really interesting. Particularly, I suppose, on the back end more than the front end, having these sort of gates in CI/CD that so, for example, if you don't pass the the security scan, there's no way that code is going into production and so on. But I hadn't realized, I assumed up front and maybe there was linters, but I'm showing my ignorance now, but I had no idea that you could make accessibility, a gating factor for a CI pipeline. And is it, from your experience in projects, does it hit often, or is it hits a lot at the start of the project, and then as you sort all your bits out, then it becomes less and less of a problem, or how does that work?
In my experience, it depends on the project. I would imagine a lot of sites that are long running and haven't been built with accessibility in mind, probably have a lot of violations that will be flagged, and just purely enabling it in CI and blocking your builds is probably going to block your builds for a long time before you can solve all of those. So I think maybe having it running is something that just highlights these violations, and then maybe once you've fixed them, enable it and to start blocking your builds so that you then don't introduce regressions is probably the approach I'd use for existing applications that are known to have lots of accessibility issues. But I think if we're talking about building it in from the beginning, then it's absolutely something that we should be blocking builds for with all of the features that roll out. So if we're starting a brand new project with accessibility in mind, I think it's absolutely something that we should accept is just going to block our builds if we're putting it in there because it's an issue. But yeah, definitely not something that I'd just switch on an existing application. I've tried that before and it doesn't go down well.
Could imagine. I can imagine. And I mean, what we've talked about, particularly on these new builds, is that you put it in from the start and you work it through. But even on more recent projects, is there usually like a third-party audit done? Is that a fairly standard thing for an external company to actually come in and validate what's being done around accessibility?
Yeah, so I mean, accessibility is a large field, and I think we shouldn't be expected as developers and designers to know all of it. I think we should definitely strive to improve our knowledge there, but there are accessibility experts out there for a reason. So I think working with third parties is the only way you can really have full confidence that your site is fully accessible. But I think if we put all of these things in place and do everything we can, and we're passionate about it, and make sure that our sites are accessible as possible from our perspective, then working with third parties is going to be a lot less stressful experience. And it is something that hopefully they'll just come in and pick things that the team weren't aware of, or things that you might have missed, rather than a 1,000 violation document of things that you've got to fix at the end of the project. So really hitting home that idea of consider it in every single thing you build from the beginning, each feature that goes out, and you shouldn't get to that point where, you know, you're going to release the project after 6 months. Should we just check that it's accessible? Obviously, unfortunately, most of the time that would raise up a lot of issues. It might even require a rewrite if we're going to make things accessible. So that's when accessibility tends to fall off. People get overwhelmed by it. They don't have time to understand a lot of these violations that are coming in, because they just have to fix because it's panic stations at that point before you go to release.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, we've flown through time here. That was incredibly fast. I can't believe we're coming towards the end. We have a couple of questions, and then I have a question for you both at the end. So let's touch on the people's questions first, just so that we don't run out of time. So this one is actually, I mentioned LinkedIn earlier. This is from Hugh on LinkedIn. How far do the Google test tools get you in terms of compliance? Is he talking about Lighthouse and that sort of thing, or
probably?
Yeah, so Google Lighthouse actually uses Axe under the hood, which is an open source tool by DQ Systems, which is actually, we mentioned we weren't going to talk about tools, but that is the automated accessibility checker that I would use. They have a browser extension that I use, and that uses, so Google Lighthouse uses that. It's a pretty good health check, I would say, but I do see people sometimes, you know, say, oh, we've got a score of 100 on Lighthouse, and then you look at the site and there are lots of accessibility issues that are missed, because you can't expect an automated checker to pick up on the user experience of things. That there are things that you need to be able to empathize with real users to decide whether they're actually an issue, and just things that just aren't practical to automate. But I would say I would still encourage people to check this. Having a score of 100 on Lighthouse is obviously not something to be sniffed at. It's something that we should aim for. I'm just trying to say that it's not enough to determine that, yes, my site is accessible. So I wouldn't expect to have a score of 100 on Lighthouse and then get a third-party audit and be confident that it would be okay. So definitely something we should pay attention to, though.
It also means you can get a lot of those easy fixes out of the way, because they create a lot of noise. So if you solve all those simple problems that are detected by automation, you can see through the trees and focus on the more complicated issues.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. We've a couple more here. So Simon asks, light mode and dark mode, is one better than the other from an accessibility point of view?
I think it's the choice that's important, probably. So we should respect the choice between the two, and certain people will prefer one over the other. I don't think there's a right answer to that, really. Okay,
that's fair. And we have an anonymous one. Can you give an example? I suppose you should read it quietly first before I read it out loud. Can you give an example of a high-profile site or app that has been the biggest surprise in how they're performing? Both good and bad, if you're allowed to say.
Have you got any, Jack? I'm trying to think of the surveys, the sites that were mentioned in the surveys.
No, I don't think they went into details on the actual sites. No, I'm not sure off the top of my head on that one.
There are some big sites that, going back to my complaints about overlays, there are some massive companies that are installing these overlays all of a sudden. So I'd be suspicious immediately of anyone that's got an overlay installed.
So basically their commitment is suspect if they're using
Perhaps, yeah.
Okay. And are icons equally as important as text from a size and color perspective?
Yes, it depends on the context a lot. It depends what the purpose that icon is serving. There's a new guideline added in 2.1 of WCAG that covers non-text contrast, which is covered by some of that. So if the icon's providing information, contrast is obviously important in the same way that text is important. But if it's supplementary, less so.
Okay, and one final one there. Is there any kind of very high level differences between web and mobile from an accessibility point of view in terms of the work you guys do?
Yes, Jack can cover this in more detail. So I think the principles are the same, and you can use WCAG guidelines. They are web guidelines, but you can certainly apply them to native apps. And there's a document from W3C that explains how to do that to some degree. And I think the next version of that is going to make that a bit easier. I believe that's the plan. And the principle of using the stuff that comes with it the native components, using those first because they've got accessibility built in, and then building on top of them is better than reinventing the wheel and building something new, because you'll have to remember to include all that accessibility stuff again.
Yeah, that's what I was going to touch on as well, just using what's baked into the platform when you're building native apps. A lot of the kind of navigation, the way screens pop and push from the stack, all of that stuff, using the native tab bars and bottom tabs in native, a lot of that stuff is already accessible and already solved by Apple and Google. So I would say, like Matt says, use the native UIs where possible, and users already know how to use those typically. One thing that I would say with iOS is it's a lot easier to kind of hook into the accessibility APIs and stuff that are available on the device. So you can detect whether a screen reader is enabled. You can have a better idea of the font size that the user is trying to set on their device, that kind of stuff. But it is very different. A lot of the tooling that we've already mentioned today doesn't work in native apps. So there are different ways to do automated checking in native apps. But it's the actual view layer under the surface is very different. You're not writing HTML, are you? So it is different. But like Matt says, a lot of the principles are the same. Color contrast is just as important. It's just the semantics that are different. So it's a different skill set, but just as important.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's it for questions. Before we wrap up, I always ask for a top tip, but maybe a parting thought rather than a top tip, because we've given lots of top tips there. Jack, what would you have a parting thought for everyone around accessibility?
My parting thought would really just be get stuck in. So if you're going to do anything when you go away from this call, if you're working on a website at the moment, try and use it with just a keyboard. Put your mouse down. See if you can perform all of the actions that you can with a mouse with just a keyboard. That's a really fundamental requirement for a lot of accessibility, and a lot of different assistive technology and a lot of users. So if you're doing that and you're finding barriers, try and fix those, and you're on your way to making sure your site's more accessible. Other than that, like I mentioned, Windows, Mac OS both have screen readers built in. I think there's a common misconception that people have that screen readers are these expensive tools that only people that are blind have access to, but you've got them built into your operating system. Look for tutorials on how to use those. There's lots of cheat sheets out there. Just being able to navigate around your website with a screen reader and get it to read the content out for you is a really good start, and should help you along the way to fixing a lot of issues and finding barriers and empathizing with those users. And kind of coming across some of the things that they face when using your product. So just go out and try it, and look into some of these tools we've recommended. That's
super. I love. I'm going to have that word empathy kind of burnt into my brain, I think, because I think it's so important for all of this. And Matt, do you have a parting thought?
Yeah, so I probably repeat my complaints about overlays and my warning about overlays. So instead of investing in those third-party overlay things, invest in your own team and your own products, and solve the problems where the problems exist, rather than bolting on a thing at the end. And invest in inclusive designs, that you're thinking about it all the way from the beginning and not trying to solve it as part of testing.
And investment. So you're investing in your future as well as an organization.
Absolutely.
I think so. Yeah. That's super. So thanks guys. This is as I said, I've learned. I knew nothing fundamentally coming in. I might have thought I knew something going in. I knew nothing, and this has been amazing, and I'm convinced everybody who listens to this, whether live or later, will find it valuable. And we're on again next month. And next month it's going to be two people some of you may be familiar with. We have DevOps. It says Master Expert. On the note I've been sent, I'd say even more about David Gonzalez. And Technical Director Matteo Collina, who yesterday explained promises to all the people who don't understand how promises work. But they're going to be talking about DevOps and a lot more about DevOps. So that's on the 6th of May, and I hope you can all dial in. So thanks, guys. Thanks for that. It was awesome, and hopefully we'll do another one in a couple of months when you've recovered from this one.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.